the other part of that is the dichotomy of science and religion, which is part of that complexity. But they are incredibly somehow intertwined and putting up against each other and struggling, and which is again so real and so much who we are as the creatures that we are. And is that science and religious sort of conflict? How does that play into your thinking? I mean, is that part of your?
Well, I see them. I mean, I think at one point the narrator says, they're doppelgangers. Pick your apple. Adams and Eve's or Isaac Newton's. It's basically the same apple. They're all trying to make the implausible, the mysterious, the day before Genesis, coherent to us. And they're all, both are trying to make the case. They're both vying for our attention to tell us how it is on Earth. But, at the end of the day, they're just telling stories. It's a little harsh, I guess.
I mean, if you really examine the human condition, that's all we're doing. We're constantly in a fictional world. I mean, there's nothing else but the worlds that we create for ourselves. So it's a really interesting thing to kind of have the two brothers, the academic and the sort of scientist player, which was
Johnny
really
Appleseed's
exactly, which is really interesting to me because one of them is sort of tends to be on the rational side, but he has a heart, and then the other one is kind of a little off, but incredibly interesting, and is a scientist, and he will find any fact and any niche and anything that he can find and pin it up and observe it. I mean, it is so incredibly telling of who we are, and not just that fictional group of people, but who we are as creatures.
Yeah.
And I think that to me was incredibly interesting. And the other thing that was interesting to me is your vast knowledge in these areas. I mean, you spoke with real confidence about certain scientific research and understanding. You tied it all together beautifully. The religious thing was there in a really smart way. The sort of the non-religious thing was there. So you obviously are a great reader of really important text, because for you to be able to write that book, to make it so rich, you did some amazing thinking. So can you talk a little bit about that process? I mean, that built up through the years, obviously, but how did it all come together? I mean, I'm reading this thing and I'm saying, does he have like 7 books open? Because I would have, I'm always checking my facts, and there you were narrating this stuff that is just so incredibly rich, historically, scientifically.
There was a joke about some of my colleagues that this is sort of my theory of superficial knowledge. Great breath, but not a whole lot.
It felt much deeper.
I'm a dilettante.
I don't know. It just felt much deeper than that.
Yeah.
It felt like you knew. And I think that's what I admired. And that's why I loved reading it, because it related life to ideas. And I think just like architecture does that, relates life to ideas. That was what caught me, because there's so many books that just don't have any ideas.
Well, it's in one of the interviews, I don't know whether it was with Scott Cheshire or who wrote the piece for the book of Rail, or one of the other interviewers. I was talking about the drafts of the book, and the first draft of the book read like Taylor Thatcher, the protagonist who narrates, like he was given a lecture. That's the hardest thing when you're so ambitious about the ideas that you want to get across. These are complex ideas. It's very, very hard to do that without sounding like you're giving a history lecture or a science lecture or preaching a sermon. that was the most difficult part of writing the book, is getting it so that you felt like there was a story being told, not that you were just, hearing some talking head yakking about complex stuff.
Well, and I think also your choice of characters, the professor, and who would be a knowledgeable person, and the dilettante brother who is extremely smart and interested. So I mean, the characters pushed you probably into sharing this kind of knowledge. So I'll end up with talking about your relationship to nature, which is really interesting because nature plays a huge part in this. Again, it's the protagonist in the book, just like history is. I mean, these are very strong characters, history, religion, and nature. And was that in your mind because there's so much kind of beginning really interesting talk about how we integrate with nature more, or was that just very natural for you to kind of pull that subject into your character?
It's pretty natural. Everybody always asks. I mean, fiction writers, how much of it is autobiographical? My affection for the natural world is very long-standing. I come from it's really in my bones. In fact, my dear cousin Alex Matheson is here tonight. He's the son of Peter Matheson, for whom I am named. And Peter's father, my grandfather, really drove home through his family an appreciation of nature. He was very involved in the Audubon Society and conservancies all up and down the East Coast. And so all of us in our family have a very deep connection to the natural world. All my brothers are naturalists, ornithologists, science, environmental writers, and so on. So, that's always been my life, being out in the natural world. I'm an expat from Maine, living in New York City.
So again, you go away from this modernist glass box, which keeps nature as a wallpaper, and takes sort of an insider's view of it, but really not doing anything with it. And so you really immersed yourself in this sort of muck, this sort of primordial muck, which is so interesting.
You're making me remind me of being on a review in David Levin's studio last year. The students had this really lovely kind of a rendering, Photoshop rendering, in which they were doing a remediated landscape, and they would run a little wetland, and they put ducks, Photoshop ducks in it, and it was really a clean version of nature. And I was sitting on the review, and I said, what I really like is the idea I can take my shoes off and go into that pond and go. And everybody went, but yeah, that's the primordial month.
No, we should have more of that in architecture.
Photoshop command for that.
It has to come with the soundtrack.
Yeah.
The first part of Susan's question relates to what I'd like to ask was Joe's sort of touchstone within the text in terms of his practice as a teacher of writing to designers in the past and present. And it was a huge project to organize. And I think I had asked you before if there were drawings involved or diagrams involved, or if I can imagine a designer learning about this. You could build a model of this book, right? You could definitely, it definitely has sectional properties. It has all kinds of, there are all kinds of ways to use the tools of design to plan this. I don't need to divulge the process or reveal the secrets. But I wonder if Joe, if you could speak to what your experience was teaching, your experience of the novel was, and how that might relate to your experience teaching students of design.
Well, let's see. First of all, I feel totally intimidated right now in this panel. There's so many. This is such a lovely conversation about the book. When I go to readings, there's generally questions about did you use a pen or. So let me start with the last Parsons, that was a time when I had a lot of students who were, I'm interested that you said you were a fine arts painting major in college. A lot of my students would come in covered with paint and their fingernails would be all covered with paint. And they were working really hard and they were tired. And I would put them through a 4-draft process for each one of the papers because if I didn't, they were so busy doing so many different things. But what was interesting about these students versus the students I taught in Massachusetts and then even at the new school proper was that they took to process, they took to drafting. You know, it's interesting you talked about the symmetries in his work, and that's something that I see now to talk about his novel. The structure of his novel is so built and constructed in certain ways. But, sort of getting to what Susan was saying, this quality where there's so much information, what we would call the density of the texture of the prose, right? And then you're talking about trying to assimilate it all within the fictive techniques of having it be sort of rendered in a way that doesn't seem as though it's just expository writing on the page. And so these are all techniques that fiction writers would apply. His character, Taylor, is a sensualist in many ways. And so there's ways that he's describing women and landscapes and even casinos. And it's a rich experience and every time I read those experiences as a writer who's been a fan of John Updike, who was a visual artist and applied a lot of that in his own description, I thought I could learn from Peter Wheelwright here. And so whenever he was in moments of description, I was looking at it and I was thinking about this idea about drafting and the students that I had. There is this way that when I was working with those students at Parsons, it was very difficult for me to get them to write expository. They always moved into this creative realm, describing what they saw and sort of touching it in a much more personal way. So working with them was interesting. They were hard workers. They were really willing to do drafts. They saw the creative process as one that goes on and on. It's never quite finished, right? That was a great experience. I too was in that moment in graduate school and realizing I had to complete drafts. So there was an affinity in the way we worked together. But they would always say to me, I'm a visual learner. You're trying to get me to do something that's not in my learning set. And so when I've come to Peter's work, and I've just met Peter recently, and I'm actually writing a piece on his book right now, since I've deep in thought about it. But there's a way that he's taken the techniques that fiction writers use to create a world. You talked about the social implications, and Peter was talking about Rorty. Frank O'Connor was an Irish writer and critic who talked about good fiction activating the moral imagination, giving enough details of all the senses so that the reader forgets she's reading a book or being talked to about certain ideas, certain history or religion, but enters it and feels it. And your work does that. It's sensual in the sense that I'm smelling things, I'm hearing sounds. The piece you read, I was actually going to talk about if there was time. I don't think there is, but there's a beautiful moment where you talked about Esther, and you talked about her being disheveled and dream swollen. And you talked about his confidence. When I read this book, I thought, this is not a debut novel. I mean, there's such polish and care and time taken with everything. Your sentences themselves, you talk about symmetry, are balanced in really beautiful ways. Even disheveled and dream swollen, forget just the beautiful original vision. I have never seen dream swollen until you said it, and now, I see dream swollen. But even on I'll steal it. But even on the level of the line, the parallelism of it, the alliteration, the assonance of just disheveled and dream swollen, you could scan it. On the level of prose, there's a craftsmanship that went into this book that I'm a little bit envious of and wanted to talk